Empires are often remembered as the result of vision, leadership, and unity. But when we look closely at how empires actually form, a different pattern emerges. They do not grow quietly. They expand through pressure, repetition, and force. Charlemagne's empire was no exception. This story is not about Charlemagne as a symbol of Europe or a father of nations. It is about how his empire was built, step by step, through nearly constant war. Not a single campaign, not a single decisive battle, but a lifetime of conflict that reshaped entire regions and generations. For those who lived under Charlemagne's rule, empire did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as soldiers, demands, and obligations. Villages were absorbed, borders shifted, customs were replaced. And resistance, when it appeared, was answered not with compromise, but with force. Charlemagne ruled for decades, and during most of that time, his empire was at war somewhere. Understanding his reign means understanding war not as an interruption of rule, but as its foundation. The empire did not exist first and fight later. It fought in order to exist. This is the story of how an empire was built through endurance, obedience, and violence, and why Charlemagne could never stop expanding without risking everything he had created. Charlemagne was born into a world where peace was fragile and temporary. Western Europe in the 8th century was not unified, stable, or secure. Power was local, contested, and constantly under pressure. Borders were unclear, loyalty shifted, authority depended less on law and more on the ability to enforce decisions. From the beginning, Charlemagne inherited more than land. He inherited a system that expected rulers to act through force. To rule meant to campaign. To maintain authority meant to prove it repeatedly. A king who did not fight risked being ignored, challenged, or replaced. Even before Charlemagne ruled alone, warfare shaped his environment. The Frankish realm expanded and contracted through conflict. Neighbors tested its strength. Internal rivals watched for weakness. War was not an extraordinary event. It was a regular tool of politics. This environment shaped how Charlemagne understood leadership. Power did not come from stability, it came from momentum. Expansion created security, while hesitation invited attack. The idea of a fixed border was less important than the ability to move armies quickly and impose control. As Charlemagne rose to power, he did not face a choice between peace and war. That choice did not exist in practice. His position required constant action. Each campaign solved one problem while creating another. Conquest brought new land, but also new enemies, new obligations, and new fronts to defend. This created a pattern that would define his entire reign. War led to expansion. Expansion required more war. The empire grew not because it sought greatness, but because stopping would expose it to collapse. For the people who lived within these territories, this meant living inside a cycle that never fully ended. Soldiers were raised repeatedly. Resources were redirected toward campaigns. Communities adapted to the expectation that war would return, even if it left for a time. By the time Charlemagne stood as the dominant ruler of Western Europe, his authority rested on decades of conflict, not as memory, but as structure. The empire was already shaped by war before it could even be called an empire. And as Charlemagne began to look beyond his existing borders, the question was no longer whether he would fight again, but how far war would be allowed to carry his rule. When people look at the size of Charlemagne's empire, it is tempting to assume that expansion was driven by ambition alone, a desire for glory, a hunger for territory. But this interpretation simplifies something far more complex. In Charlemagne's world, expansion was not a luxury, it was a requirement for survival. The Frankish realm did not exist behind secure borders. It was surrounded by rivals, unstable regions, and peoples who resisted absorption. Every frontier represented uncertainty. Every neighboring power represented a potential threat. In such an environment, standing still was dangerous. A ruler who stopped expanding created space for others to advance. Charlemagne understood that borders were not lines on a map. They were zones of pressure. If they were not actively controlled, they collapsed inward. Expansion pushed danger away from the center, but it also created new edges that required defense. This is where the logic of near-constant war began to take shape. Each campaign reduced one risk while producing another. War then became cyclical, not because Charlemagne sought endless conflict, but because the empire he ruled could not remain stable without it. Newly conquered territories needed garrisons. Garrisons required supplies. Supplies demanded taxation and organization. Organization required authority. Authority, in turn, had to be demonstrated through force. This pattern reshaped how expansion was justified. Campaigns were framed as defensive even when they crossed far beyond existing borders. The language of protection masked the reality of absorption. To protect the empire, Charlemagne had to enlarge it. To enlarge it, he had to fight. For the people living at the edges of Frankish power, this logic felt relentless. Villages that had never considered themselves part of a larger political project suddenly found themselves targeted. They were not attacked because they had declared war, but because they existed outside the system Charlemagne was building. Once incorporated, these regions did not rest. They were reorganized, taxed, and expected to contribute soldiers. Resistance was interpreted not as disagreement, but as disorder. Disorder threatened the stability of the whole, and instability justified further campaigns. Over time, Charlemagne's rule began to operate like a machine that required constant movement. Armies marched almost every year. Even periods described as peaceful were often pauses between campaigns. War became seasonal, expected, and routine. This had consequences for how authority was perceived. Charlemagne was not seen merely as a king who occasionally fought wars. He was seen as a ruler whose power was inseparable from warfare itself. Victory reinforced legitimacy. Failure risked fragmentation. The empire's size became proof of its ruler's strength. Yet, this necessity carried a hidden cost. Each expansion absorbed new peoples with different customs, languages, and loyalties. Holding them required more force, more oversight, more punishment. The empire grew heavier with every conquest. What looked like strength from a distance felt like strain up close. Charlemagne's campaigns created an empire that depended on his personal presence and authority. He traveled constantly, moving between regions, addressing unrest, organizing defense. The empire did not function automatically. It functioned because Charlemagne never stopped managing it through force. For soldiers, this meant that service never truly ended. One campaign flowed into another. Victories brought no rest, only new obligations. War was not a moment of crisis. It was the normal condition of imperial life. For communities, it meant living under a power that was always preparing for the next conflict. Resources were redirected. Young men were levied. The rhythm of life adjusted around military expectation. By this point in Charlemagne's reign, war was no longer simply a tool. It was the structure that held everything together. Expansion had become necessity, and necessity had become habit. And nowhere would this logic be more visible, or more brutal, than in Charlemagne's longest and most relentless conflict, a war that would last decades and reshape an entire people. If there is one conflict that reveals what Charlemagne's empire truly was, it is the Saxon Wars. These were not short campaigns, nor were they resolved through a single decisive victory. They lasted more than 30 years. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but intermittent war. And in that duration lies their meaning. The Saxons were not a rival kingdom in the traditional sense. They were a collection of tribes, communities, and local leaders who lived beyond the eastern frontier of the Frankish world. They did not share Charlemagne's political structure, religion, or understanding of authority. From the Frankish perspective, this made them unstable. From Charlemagne's perspective, it made them dangerous. What began as frontier conflict gradually transformed into something much larger. Each campaign into Saxon territory followed a familiar pattern. Frankish armies would advance, defeat local resistance, destroy symbolic sites, and extract submission. Hostages would be taken. Leaders would swear loyalty. Conversion to Christianity would be demanded. And then the army would withdraw. For a brief moment, the empire appeared secure. But submission did not last. As soon as Frankish forces retreated, resistance returned. Old customs reasserted themselves. Local leaders rejected imposed authority. Sacred sites were rebuilt. This cycle repeated again and again, year after year, creating a war that never truly ended. For Charlemagne, this was intolerable. His empire depended on obedience that endured beyond his immediate presence. The Saxons refused that logic. They did not resist once. They resisted continually. And in doing so, they exposed the weakness of an empire built on expansion without permanent integration. Over time, Charlemagne's response hardened. What had begun as military suppression became cultural and religious destruction. Saxon sacred places were not merely defeated, they were erased. Forest shrines were cut down. Ritual sites were destroyed. These acts were not tactical. They were symbolic. The goal was not just to defeat Saxon armies, but to break Saxon identity. Religion became inseparable from conquest. Conversion was no longer encouraged. It was enforced. Baptism became a condition of survival. Refusal was interpreted as rebellion, not belief. Faith was weaponized as a tool of imperial order. This transformation marked a turning point. War was no longer about borders alone. It was about reshaping people. The empire demanded not only submission, but transformation. Those who could not or would not change were treated as enemies, regardless of whether they carried weapons. The violence escalated accordingly. Entire communities were punished for resistance. Crops were destroyed, livestock seized, populations displaced. These actions were not accidents of prolonged war. They were strategies designed to make resistance impossible to sustain. One event, more than any other, illustrates how far this conflict had gone. In 782, after yet another Saxon uprising, Charlemagne ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners at Verdun. The exact number remains debated, but the intent is clear. This was not a battlefield necessity. It was an act of terror designed to end resistance through fear. For the empire, this act sent a message. Disobedience would not be corrected. It would be eliminated. For the Saxons, it confirmed that the war was no longer about territory or power sharing. It was about survival. The choice was submission, conversion, and absorption, or destruction. From this point on, the Saxon Wars became less visible as conventional warfare and more permanent as occupation. Garrisons remained. Frankish law replaced local custom. Children were taken and raised under imperial authority. Resistance did not disappear, but it fragmented, weakened, and became isolated. For soldiers, the Saxon Wars were exhausting. Campaign after campaign brought little sense of resolution. Victories felt temporary. The enemy seemed endless. War became routine rather than exceptional. Service blurred into a lifetime obligation. For Charlemagne, the conflict revealed both the strength and the cost of his empire. He could impose control. He could destroy resistance. But doing so required constant violence, constant presence, and an acceptance that peace would never truly arrive. The Saxon Wars did not end because harmony was achieved. They ended because resistance was broken beyond recovery. What remained was a transformed region, absorbed into the empire through force, fear, and restructuring. In this conflict, Charlemagne achieved what many rulers could not: the complete subjugation of a people. But he also revealed the empire's deepest truth. It was not held together by shared identity or voluntary loyalty. It was held together by the expectation of force. And once that expectation became normal, it reshaped not only the conquered, but the conqueror himself. Charlemagne did not rule from a single center. His empire was too large, too diverse, and too unstable for stillness. To govern it, he had to move, constantly. The court traveled with him, carrying authority across roads that were never fully secure. In this sense, rule itself became a form of motion, as essential as warfare had been to expansion. This mobility was not ceremonial. It was practical and necessary. Charlemagne's presence solved problems that structures alone could not. Rebellions quieted when he arrived. Disputes were settled more quickly. Loyalty felt stronger when the ruler stood in front of those who owed it. Distance weakened authority. Proximity reinforced it. As a result, governance blurred into campaign life. Decisions were made in camps, halls, and temporary residences. Orders traveled slowly. Enforcement depended on local agents whose loyalty had to be monitored. The empire functioned because Charlemagne never allowed it to rest without supervision. This constant movement placed enormous strain on administration. Laws had to be enforced across regions with different customs. Justice had to appear consistent without being identical. Officials known as missi dominici were sent to represent the emperor's authority, pairing churchmen and nobles to observe, judge, and report. Their task was not simply to administer law, but to watch for signs of weakness. Even so, oversight was imperfect. Local power always threatened to drift away from the center. Counts grew comfortable. Bishops accumulated influence. Regions interpreted orders in ways that suited them. Charlemagne understood this danger. His rule depended on preventing any one part of the empire from becoming too independent. This is where fear and favor intertwined. Loyalty was rewarded with land and authority. Disobedience was punished decisively. The empire did not run on trust. It ran on balance, a careful distribution of power designed to prevent challenges from within. Religion played a stabilizing role, but not a peaceful one. Church reform was tightly linked to imperial control. Bishops were expected to support authority. Monasteries became centers of order and surveillance as much as spirituality. Faith reinforced obedience, but only when aligned with imperial goals. For ordinary people, this meant living under a rule that was always present but rarely personal. Charlemagne's name carried weight everywhere, even when he was absent. Orders were issued in his authority. Taxes were collected in his name. Punishments were justified by his will. The emperor became an abstraction, omnipresent and distant. Yet this abstraction concealed a fragile truth. The empire functioned because Charlemagne himself functioned. His energy, attention, and authority held it together. The system worked as long as he moved, decided, and intervened. The question that lingered beneath every reform and campaign was simple and dangerous. What would happen when he could no longer do so? As the empire expanded and matured, its dependence on a single figure grew clearer. The larger it became, the more difficult it was to manage without constant pressure. Stability existed, but it was active, not passive. It required effort every day. Charlemagne ruled a moving empire because a stationary one would have fractured. But motion carried its own cost. The emperor aged, fatigue accumulated, and the demands of governance did not lessen with time. The empire appeared strong, yet beneath its structures lay a vulnerability that no conquest could remove. The inevitability that the ruler who built it would one day be gone. As Charlemagne's empire expanded, faith became inseparable from power. This was not a coincidence, nor was it purely devotional. In a realm made of many peoples, languages, and traditions, religion offered something rare, a shared framework of obedience. But this framework only worked when it was enforced. Charlemagne did not see faith as a private matter. He saw it as a pillar of order. Christianity provided moral language, institutional structure, and legitimacy. It also provided justification. Authority framed as sacred could reach further and demand more than authority framed as political alone. Disobedience was no longer merely unlawful, it became sinful. This merging of empire and faith reshaped how conquest was understood. Military victory opened the door. Conversion sealed the result. Churches were built where resistance had stood. Monasteries followed armies. Clergy moved alongside officials, recording, instructing, and correcting. Faith did not soften rule, it organized it. For conquered peoples, this created a new kind of pressure. Acceptance of imperial authority required acceptance of imperial belief. Baptism became a marker of submission. Refusal marked one as an outsider, even an enemy. The boundary between religious difference and political rebellion disappeared. Charlemagne's laws reflected this fusion. Capitularies, royal decrees, regulated not only behavior, but belief. Attendance at church was required. Pagan practices were forbidden. Resistance to conversion carried severe penalties. Faith was not offered as a choice, it was imposed as order. This absolute approach revealed a deeper logic. Charlemagne was not attempting to create unity through persuasion. He was creating uniformity through enforcement. Diversity threatened cohesion. Cohesion required sameness. And sameness could only be achieved through authority that tolerated no alternative. The church benefited from this arrangement. Protection, land, and influence expanded under imperial favor. In return, the church reinforced obedience. Bishops supported imperial policy. Monks preserved law and memory. Religious institutions became stabilizers of conquest. For the empire, this alliance strengthened control. For individuals, it narrowed freedom. Daily life became more regulated. Behavior, ritual, and belief were observed. Authority reached into homes, customs, and conscience. Yet this system also created tension. Faith imposed by force rarely disappears quietly. Compliance may be visible, but belief lags behind. Beneath outward conformity, resentment endured. Charlemagne's empire looked unified, but it required constant vigilance to remain so. Absolute authority achieved order, but at a cost. The more control was centralized, the more fragile the system became. It relied on enforcement, not consent. And enforcement demands energy, presence, and continuity. Charlemagne had built an empire where power, war, and faith reinforced one another. But this interdependence raised a question that no decree could answer. What happens when the force holding them together weakens? As long as Charlemagne ruled, authority felt complete. But empires are tested not in moments of strength, but in moments of transition. For decades, Charlemagne had been the constant center of his empire. His authority, energy, and presence filled the gaps that structures could not. But no empire built around a single figure can avoid one question forever. What happens when that figure is no longer there? Succession was not a distant concern. It was a silent pressure that shaped Charlemagne's later years. The empire he had built through war, movement, and enforcement needed continuity to survive. Yet continuity in such a vast and diverse realm was difficult to guarantee. Loyalty that had been personal could not easily be transferred. Charlemagne attempted to prepare for this reality. He divided responsibilities, elevated heirs, and tried to formalize authority. But the system resisted simplification. Power had grown through action, not inheritance alone. Command had been earned through presence and force. Without those, authority weakened. When Charlemagne died in 814, the empire did not collapse immediately. It continued on the surface to function. Laws remained. Officials governed. The church still supported imperial order. But something essential was missing. The force that had held everything together was no longer active. Local powers began to assert themselves more confidently. Regional interests re-emerged. The careful balance Charlemagne had maintained through constant oversight began to shift. The empire's size, once its greatest strength, now became its greatest strain. What followed was not sudden chaos, but gradual fragmentation. Authority thinned as it traveled outward. Decisions took longer to enforce. Loyalty became conditional. The structures Charlemagne had built proved strong, but not self-sustaining. This revealed the empire's fundamental limit. It had been designed for expansion and control, not for long-term stability without continuous pressure. War had built it. War had maintained it. Peace alone could not preserve it. Succession exposed what conquest had hidden. The empire was not a unified body. It was a network of territories held together by expectation of force. Once that expectation weakened, cohesion followed. Charlemagne's achievement remained extraordinary. He had reshaped Western Europe and set patterns that would last centuries. But his empire also demonstrated a recurring truth of imperial power. Structures built through war rarely survive unchanged when the war ends. The empire endured, but it transformed. And in that transformation, the limits of Charlemagne's model became clear. When Charlemagne's empire is remembered, it is often remembered for its scale, its ambition, and its influence on the future of Europe. These things are real, but they are incomplete. An empire is not only defined by what it creates, but by what it demands in order to exist. Charlemagne built his empire through near-constant war. Expansion was not an episode. It was a condition. Campaigns followed one another until conflict became routine. Borders shifted not because peace had been achieved, but because pressure was constantly applied. War was the mechanism that allowed authority to reach further than law alone ever could. For those who lived within the empire, this meant living under continuous expectation. Soldiers were raised repeatedly. Resources were redirected. Communities adapted to the assumption that war would return, even if it paused. Obedience was shaped by memory of force rather than trust in institutions. Faith reinforced this system, but it did not soften it. Belief became obligation. Unity became uniformity. The alliance between empire and religion strengthened control, but it also narrowed space for difference. Compliance became visible. Consent remained uncertain. Charlemagne's rule reveals a deeper truth about imperial power. Empires built through war depend on movement, enforcement, and presence. They grow strong through action, but they struggle with stillness. The structures created to manage conquest rarely replace the need for it. After Charlemagne, the empire endured, but it could not remain what it had been. Fragmentation followed not because his successors lacked ambition, but because the conditions that had sustained authority were no longer constant. The empire had reached the limits of what force alone could maintain. Charlemagne achieved something extraordinary. He reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Europe. Yet his empire also demonstrates the cost of building power through war. Expansion brings control. Control demands enforcement. Enforcement demands energy that no single ruler can sustain forever. In the end, Charlemagne's empire was not undone by enemies alone. It was undone by the very logic that created it. War had built the empire. War had held it together, and without it, the structure could not remain unchanged. This is the hidden reality behind the empire, not a story of endless progress, but of power maintained through pressure, and the limits that pressure eventually reveals.